Okay, thanks for that. Just in general, the more people who could switch their video on, the better, because at least then I get some sort of audience reaction. It's not as good there physically, but presenting to your own image as a speaker on Zoom is enough to send you insane, I think, right? So videos are appreciated. Secondly, my plan is to speak for about 40, maybe 45 minutes. I'll be monitoring the chat, so feel free to throw stuff in there. I'm happy to respond to that as it goes along. Yeah. So if we can get this into a dialogue at that point, that's useful. I should probably start by talking about my own history in this. I've had a rather checkered career, right? So starting off in Australia on the program to combat Australia, Africa, and Latin America, on the World Council of Churches program to combat racism, which is a good way of shaking you up quite early on after you leave university. And then spent a period in HR and then moved into a career track in finance before computers got interesting, and I ended up as a decision support system consultant. Yeah. So I built, and this is the early days of computing, just to tell you how bad this is. I remember our headmaster at school, he did two things, one of which was terrible, one of which was brilliant. The brilliant thing is he made the entire academic sixth form. And you need to realize this is a Welsh elite educational system. We've been selected at 11 and 5% of us are going to go to university. So we're a bit full of ourselves, all right? And he made us do RSA stage 3 typing, which as far as we were concerned was done by dumb girls in the other school, not by us really bright super alpha males. And we protested bitterly about it, but it's the best training I've ever had, right? So that was insightful. The other thing is we had the first school computer in Wales. My first ever computer program was to actually fake physics practical results, because I found physics practicals intensely boring. Why did you have to rediscover things? But he taught us how to use punch cards. And you remember him saying, if you actually learn how to use a punch card machine, you will have a job for life. The modern equivalent is teaching Java code to school kids. By the time they graduate, they'll need something completely different. You'd be much better giving them some classes in design and anthropology so they understand human beings and also ethics rather than sort of out-of-date coding practice. Either way, I ended up designing systems for financial directors, and I was lucky because I'd been one. So I'd done the job in a smaller company. And so I started to understand something I'm going to come back to in more detail in a minute, is users never understand what technology can do for them. So if you rely on what users say they want, they're only going to say what they already know, and they're going to miss opportunities. So I took a high-risk early-stage career of writing, code for what I thought they wanted, and I got away with it. So I got promoted and ended up in a strategy role. Yeah. When I was in there, I created a thing called the Janus program. So we were heavily focused on object orientation and RAD-JAD. And this is where it starts to come into Agile. So we had a major problem getting people to adopt rapid application development, joint application development type workshops. RAD-JAD, came out of IBM Canada. It was really exciting, but waterfall dominated. Does this sound like a familiar position to be in? So people wanted a comfort level of something highly structured. We wanted to do something dynamic. So I did two things which were important. One is I attached RAD-JAD to legacy system management. So I didn't try and introduce it as a transformator. I introduced it as a differentiator on something which people already knew they wanted and wanted to buy. And that's actually a key. It's called a symbiotic strategy. You don't try and get a revolution, you add something to something people are already familiar with, so they get to learn it as they go along. And a few Agile people could have benefited from that. The other thing is we decided we never get RAD-JAD established unless we had a standard and training course and methods. So three companies, myself, my equivalent in Logica, and Ed Holt from Cambridge, got together in a pub in Cheltenham for a meal and set up the Dsdm consortium. As some of you probably know, that was one of the three main inputs into the Agile Manifesto. We were British, so we did it all over a meal in a pub in an evening. We didn't need to go to a ski resort. But critically, we did it between competitors. We didn't try and create a proprietary approach based on a single vendor. We said the way to establish in the marketplace is for competitors to be seen to be working together and create something which is open and non-proprietary. Right? So that was where I was. Yeah. Either way, moved into the strategy role. IBM took us over. I got given one of those wonderful roles, which is go away and do interesting things and we'll pay you a salary regardless. And you don't often get those. And I had it for 7 years and it was wonderful. In the course of that, I created the Cynefin framework, working on counterterrorism in DARPA. And that's sort of where a mixture of knowledge management and counterterrorism. And the XP community got to hear about it and invited me to speak at a conference in London. So having been out of IT for about 10 years, I suddenly went back into that. I mean, never been completely divided, presented it, and kind of like the takeoff of Cynefin came from that XP conference. Yeah, after that, it became a really major area of work. So I was back in software development again in that sense. And I'll make the general point, if you look at the starting point of Agile, there are 3 different elements which go into it. One is XP, the other is Scrum, and then the peripheral one is Dsdm. And only one person came from the Dsdm consortium, and I think that's why it wasn't picked up that much. But the difference between Scrum and XP, and I've said this several times, so I'll repeat it. To me, XP, and apologies to Alistair for this, is the real heart of Agile. Yeah, if Agile had scaled around XP, it would have been a lot better and more authentic to the ideas, at which point everybody from XP gives me their thumbs up, right? But the problem is that nobody in XP can make themselves understood to ordinary mortals, as a result of which nothing could actually be scaled from that, right? The secret of Scrum, and this is going back to Manifesto, it was at the right level of abstraction and codification, so it could diffuse quickly. And if you don't know Basso's work on this for the I space, it's worth looking at. High abstraction, high codification, rapid diffusion. Low abstraction, low codification, you don't get diffusion. So XP was the equivalent of a London taxi driver. Yeah, it took you years to acquire the skill and the knowledge, and your brain was altered by the process. Whereas Scrum could be taught to people and acquired very quickly, more like a map user. But once you understood the language, you could adopt it very quickly. So effectively, Agile scaled around Scrum. And the problem we got with that is, and I will say this now very clearly, everybody at the moment, particularly those who think in a shallow way, are jumping on attacks on Scrum, right? Partly because they're trying to create an alternative to it. Scrum is one of the most effective software methods I've ever seen developed. It's just not a universal, and it's a collection of methods. It's not a framework. Right? Seen it as a collection of methods, it's valuable, and I'll come back to that in a minute. Right? So everybody's attacking it, but the real problem with Scrum is it created this momentum for a training course together with a certificate. And the certification plague is actually going to kill Agile if we don't watch it. I mean, if you get into the Borg, I mean, SAFe is, to my mind, the antithesis of Agile. I mean, basically, Dean will put anything into the SAFe diagram. He's just dropped design thinking in. I'm doing my best to attack it consistently, so Cynefin never gets there. So anything you want to buy, Dean will put it into the SAFe framework and give you a certificate in it, provided you pay him money every year. I mean, and yeah, that's actually where SAFe just took this Scrum model and then built onto it in that structure. Yeah, and I'll come back to alternatives to that. So a lot of us of the last few years have started, and the other thing you also need to understand is that during the course of this, I also created my own software company. So we now actually use our own methods, and we use Agile techniques in developing SenseMaker, which for anybody interested is going to deploy into Ukraine live in a couple of days for field capture of refugee stories and actual stories of experience. And we want to make that available more worldwide. So if you keep an eye on my social media channels, you'll see when that's available to download. So I kind of like teach people about this stuff, but I also manage a company which is for 18 years now has actually built ethnographic software in the field. So that's kind of like my background, right? I'm still at heart a decision support specialist. That's my first love. Yeah, how do you use technology to get human beings to make better decisions not how do you get technology to make decisions for human beings. So that concept of augmentation is where I sit, and I'll defend that. So the rewilding concept is an important one because it takes an evolutionary approach. It doesn't say that you can return to the original state, because you can't. And this is kind of like path dependency. What has gone before determines what is now. So Agile is what Agile has become. And the big question at the moment is Agile reaching the end of its life cycle? There are 3 certain signs, by the way, that something is reaching the end of its life cycle. I'm going to be slightly wicked here. One is that IBM adopts it as strategic. All right. The other is you get mass commodification, i.e. everything becomes a commodity. And the third is that Steve Denning writes a best-selling book about it. All of these are early indications that something is starting to lose its utility, right? And they're all present. So the rewilding concept is to restore balance, not to return to the original state. Right? And that's why I like that phrase, and it's got picked up. When you rewild an ecology, you recognize where it is and you start to rebalance it. Yeah? And part of that is not going down the fad cycle. So for example, anybody remember mission statements? They were the big thing, all right? Well, now the consultants can't make any money out of that, so they've recalled them purpose statements. And everything being done under purpose is exactly the same thing that's done under methods. And by the way, if you're not up to date, people are now talking about the need for deep purpose because purpose isn't making the money anymore. So we really want to sort of break that cycle and get into something which is more a balance. And I'll make a statement now, I'll talk about something we're doing at the moment in a minute, is what Agile should really be about is a collection of methods and tools from multiple vendors which can be assembled to provide solutions for clients, not a single proprietary set of methods reliant on certification. All right, so there's a huge amount of value in SAFe, largely because SAFe has stolen everything from virtually everybody else bar 3 methods. The problem is in the way it's assembled into a highly structured environment. And remember, the first time I saw the SAFe diagram looks like an engineer's model of a hydrocarbon plant, by the way. And the minute you see it, that's what it looks like. And remember, the first time I saw it, I said, look, this is wrong a priori. You don't scale a complex system by aggregation. This is just wrong a priori. And I wrote a really angry blog post. My best blog posts are the ones I write in 10 minutes in a state of anger, right? Called The Infantilization of Management, which still gets quote in the SAFe and anti-SAFe communities from time to time. And I haven't, go and look at the threads of the discussion which came on that. Yeah. So again, to come back to this, what we're trying to say is we need to get some balance back into the system. We need to recognize, and I'll give where I'm going on in a minute. So if I take Scrum, what we're now starting to do is say, how do we decompose a method or a framework into its lowest coherent unit? Now, this is something I'm posting a blog about tonight, by the way. So the key thing about scaling in a complex adaptive system is you don't scale by aggregation or imitation. You don't scale by saying this worked, so we'll do it again. And by the way, that's the problem with the use of the word empirical in the Agile community. I mean, first of all, they haven't read any philosophy, so they misuse the term. But what empiricism means in Agile is, well, it worked for me the last time, so I'll carry on doing it this way until it doesn't work. Yeah, and that's actually quite bad practice, right, in terms of the way things work. So one of the key things in complexity is we want to know what's the lowest level of coherence and what are the interactions between those lowest levels. This is almost like object orientation going back to the 80s. Is what is it? Is it polymorphic? How does it interact? Because then we can manage the interactions to produce a new method. So if I take Scrum, for example, one of the lowest coherent levels is a sprint. So what I should be able to do is to say, well, a sprint's a cool idea, but why don't I replace it with a 3-month time box? Yeah, you see what I'm doing? I'm breaking methods down into coherent units and saying I can now recombine them in very different ways. And for people interested in this, we're about to launch a whole new approach to facilitation. And we're working with people in the Agile community to effectively produce a series of hexagon cards for every component in every Agile method. Yeah, we're picking up with the Essence crew. In fact, we've got a partnership with them we're developing at the moment. So the basic concept is, instead of adopting something like SAFe or LESS or whatever, or PMI's latest attempt, what you actually instead do is to say, well, I need to do this, and I need to do this. And that ecology can have new methods and tools introduced to it. So it's a constantly evolving set of stabilities. So you need the stability of coherent methods and tools, but you need the instability of combining them in novel and different ways to meet changing contexts. And that's a key concept of scaling the complex adaptive system. So let me give you some examples of that. So one of the areas we focused on, well, there's a traditional area we're currently redeveloping at the moment. So we're taking the time box concept from Dsdm. And for those of you who haven't used time boxes, you have two variables. One variable is a minimal viable product as against a maximum achievable product. And the other is a minimal level of resource against a maximum level of resource. And so what the team does is they accept a delivery within those two ranges. So, but they always guarantee to deliver on a date. Right? Because actually what users need and what people in multi-project environments need is to know that they will get something on a certain date, not that if you fancy it and you go through multiple iterations, it may get delivered 3 months later. And so date is key. So what you actually know is, on this date, you will get at least the minimal viable product for the maximum budgeted resource, which you'll probably get somewhere between. Right? So that's a technique we're bringing back and structuring, because you don't have to do cycles in 2 weeks. You don't have to do retrospectives in days. Yeah, sometimes you can have a 3-month time box is far more effective and gives the team more actual autonomy to organize their workload. And that's a sort of granularity issue. But the big area we're focused on, and I want to run through 3 methods on this because it will indicate what we're doing, is Agile is very poor at understanding users. In fact, in general, IT people don't like users very much. They generally regard them as sort of people you shouldn't have to talk to, and would they please nominate one of them as a user executive who can make decisions on their behalf, who we speak to as little as possible, all right? Because we're the experts and we want to deliver it, yeah? So that's fine, all right? I understand that, right? So if you actually look at it, and if you go back to Ken's work on Scrum, the percentage of sprints which fail is actually not high enough. Yeah, if you actually look at it overall, because actually you need, and one of the problems is that Scrum involves too big a resource commitment for it to fail consistently. It's not small enough. Yeah, failures have to be small and early. So one of the things we're focused on, I'm going to go through 3 methods on this, is different ways of understanding user requirements, which will then feed into a process like Scrum. For anybody, and I'm going to assume some knowledge of Cynefin, in Cynefin, Scrum is not a complex technique, it's a liminal complex to complicated technique. The great strength of Scrum is its ability to take half-formed requirements and structure them, but it doesn't handle true complexity because it's got insufficient ambiguity within it, insufficient variety. Yeah? And by the way, doing linear experiments, which is what Scrum does, is not a complex technique. In complexity, you do parallel experiments, and you do lots of them. So let's go through 3 techniques. One we're doing is, and we've actually used this in social contexts as well, we're doing this a lot in organizational change, is called entangled trios. All of the methods I'm going to talk about are in an open source wiki. You can join that wiki, you can look at the methods, all right? So I'm not doing anything proprietary at this stage. So the way entangled trios works in organizational change, for example, is we say everybody who joins the company is put in a trio with somebody who's about to retire for the company, and somebody on middle management who's been identified as a high flyer. And what we do is we throw problems at multiple trios rather than a single task force. This is called the Grandparent Syndrome, by the way, or generational teaming. The reason I call it the Grandparent Syndrome is grandparents will say things to their grandchildren that they won't say to their children and vice versa. And I still remember when I was a C-level executive, I was given an assistant who was 10 years younger than me and paid half of what I was paid and asked to mentor her. And I knew exactly what that was about. It was so after 9 months they could replace me. So she learned absolutely nothing, but my grad assistant knew everything. Right? That sort of transgenerational transfer is a key thing to understand, right? Now in Agile, we're doing that with a variation. So what we'll do is take a bright young coder, somebody who's really good at fast prototyping, but terribly naive, ideally straight out of college and really naive, but lots of exciting ideas, with a sort of tired old cynic. Generally systems architects and end user system testers come into this, by the way, and as some of you know, I always say the cynics are the ones who care in an organization, but they're prepared to speak up even when it's not in their own interests. So what we do is to actually put those two together with a user trained to talk to IT people. We've been doing this for a few years now. We're about to make that training public. It's a lot easier to train users to talk to IT people than train IT people to understand users. And I can go into the cognitive science of that if you want. And so what I'll do is, if I've got an area of investigation, is throw 15, 20 trios at the problem and see what they come up with after a couple of weeks, rather than send out a single systems analyst to interview people. Now that fits in with the natural science approach we adopt. So you've probably all heard this one 1,000 times, but I'll repeat it. If you give radiologists a batch of x-rays and ask them to look for anomalies, and on the final x-ray, you put a picture of a gorilla, which is 48 times the size of a cancer nodule, 83% of radiologists will not see it, even though their eyes physically scan it. Right? That's just a fact about human cognition. So we need to find the 17%. And the only way you can find that is not by training people to observe everything, because radiologists are pretty well trained already. It's by putting multiple diverse networks to play, so you get multiple perspectives in a shortened timescale. Yeah, this also, by the way, engages more users, it educates users, it gives you a panel of people to go back with ideas, and you'll come up with novelty. Yeah? And by the way, the cost-benefit equation, the cost itself of a series of trios is significantly less than the cost of a systems analyst, and produces a more diverse result. So that's one example. Yeah. The other one, which is a technique I originally developed again in Dsdm, which is called mutated JADs, or 888. Now, I need to confess at this point that this is entirely accidental, and the method arose as a result of me making a disastrous mistake, but not admitting it to it, and it luckily worked out. Right? Lots of things develop that way. So we developed highly sophisticated JAD sessions. In fact, we actually used to use bids that way. So I still remember we won a stock exchange bid against Accenture by running a 2-day JAD in which we produced a best and final offer from IBM for a $6.8 million project at the end of 2 days of intensive joint working with the client. Anybody wants to know about those, it's very valuable, it works really well. So we developed this sort of technique. And we'd really sort of got rid of systems analysts and entity flow diagrams and things like that, all of which are designed to make sure that users sign up to things they don't understand, but we can blame them for later. There's an awful lot of that within the IT community. So we developed that technique, and we had this massive defense project, which involved running about 20 or 30 JADs. And we had a very limited time to do it in. So I decided to run one on 3 time zones. So what I'll do is I've got a team in Mumbai, I've got a team in Frisco as it actually happens, yeah, and I've got a team at Farnborough in the UK. So we'll run the JAD session with the users in Farnborough, and we'll develop a prototype. The main output of JAD tends to be prototypes rather than documents. Prototypes are much more useful for users. And then we'll pass on the requirement and the prototype to Mumbai and give them 8 hours to work on it. They'll pass it on to San Francisco, we'll get 8 hours to work on it, and then we'll wake up the next day and we've had 3 iterations in effect. Right? So we've done this, it worked. And then for one of them, I completely forgot to pass on the user requirement. Now, I'd done 3 days of facilitation. And by the way, this is exhausting as a facilitator, all right? I was deadbeat. I just passed on the prototype and forgot to pass on the requirement. Now, luckily, it went to Mumbai first, not to San Francisco. Mumbai just thought that was part of the game, so they worked on it. They passed it on to Frisco, who complained bitterly that they didn't know what the user wanted, but Mumbai said, well, we managed it and he's asleep anyway, so you'll have to deal with it. I woke up at 4 o'clock in the morning in a cold sweat because I realized the error of my ways, all right? And said, oh, well, I'll just turn up and see what happens. And I still remember it came back from Frisco and the users looked at it and said, oh my God, we would never have thought of that. Could we please have it? And now I realize what we actually did is we deliberately introduced mutation, and mutation increases variety. Yeah, it's a very racist term in England. We call it Chinese whispers. I don't know what you call it in the States. So one kid whispers in one person's ear and then they whisper in the next one. I think it's called telegraph or something, isn't it? Which is less racist.
Telephone.
Okay, so what you're doing is you're deliberately introducing a degree of mutation to see what comes out of it. Yeah. And the third one, this has come out of 3 years of work we've been doing on design thinking, because design thinking is in the same state of commodification as Agile. It's even got the same sort of training courses at the moment. IDEO will make you a design thinker if you pay them for some slides and an online course, right? So we work with professors from MIT, from Stanford, from Rand over about 2 to 3 years on this. And we're focused on 3 things. One is distributed ethnography. So so if you can imagine a 2x2 matrix, I occasionally use 2x2s just to get started. So on the vertical dimension, you've got discovery or ethnography, and it's either expert-led or it's group-led. And on the horizontal dimension, you've got ideation, ideas generation, which is either expert-based or group-based. So the bottom left-hand box is expert ideation, expert discovery. That's what IDEO do. Their designers come out, they interview you, they observe you, they go away, they come up with ideas, they test the ideas. It's all well and good, but it's limited by that imagination. That's actually where the double diamond sits. Yeah, if you want to look at it. So we add, if I go top right, top left of that matrix, we add distributed ethnography. So for example, what we're about to do in the Ukraine is distributed a Gemba app, which means people continuously cap in either oral, written, or visual format, or any combination of that, any experience they're having. But critically, they self-interpret into a quantitative framework. This links in with a feminist concept called epistemic justice. Power lies in the ability to interpret your narrative, not to tell it. So we pass that power of interpretation to the point of origin. And that's also important in analytical terms because the primary analysis is now at the point of creation of the data, not after the data has been collected. And that's a big switch. So that allows us to look at patterns of user experience. So for example, if I put the Gemba system in place with a sample of users for 3 months or 2 months or 2 weeks, and every time they're frustrated or have an idea or find something they would like some help with, they write a story about it, then I can look for patterns in those stories and give the patterns over to a programmer to produce a prototype to test their understanding. And by the way, I dislike story points intensely because story points involve some experts interpreting experiences into what they already understand. And that's dangerous. So I think Ron's come out in favor against that as well now, right? So we would prefer to give a programming team a cluster of real experiences than a single story point. Yeah, and we can do that, mathematically in that sense. Bottom right is distributed ideation. But expert, so you define a problem, you then distribute it to the whole of workforce in real time to generate ideas. Now, if anybody hasn't seen the EU field guide on complexity management, I'll put the link in the chat so you've got it. This is the first government publication based on complexity theory, which talks about complexity management. One of the big features of that is the need for a human sensor network. So this is the ability to generate ideas over the whole of the workforce in real time. One of the reasons we're going to deploy in Ukraine is to build a sensor network that we can ask questions of and get answers back in 5 or 10 minutes, assuming they've got connectivity. And that sort of capability is critical during a crisis. You do not have time to commission research. You need a highly diverse network. And this is also about outlier identification. You want to find the outliers fast because they've seen something nobody else has seen. And then we can combine the two. This is called exaptive innovation. Or in the EU field guide, it's called radical repurposing. So this is where you find things you already know how to do and you repurpose them for something completely novel. And that is the safest form of innovation, and it's the dominant form of innovation in technology anyway. I'll give you 2 examples, one of which is very recent. A Raytheon engineer noticed when he was maintaining a radar machine in 1945 that chocolate bars melted in his pocket. He realized it was the magneto, so he put a metal box around the magneto and we got microwave ovens. Okay? In biology, that's called exaptation. And if you look at the history of technology development, it's generally repurposing things we already are good at rather than starting from scratch. And again, the granularity is key there. By reducing to the, it's the magneto which allows you to do it, not the radar machine. That's too big. Yeah. So one of the things we now do is we map existing capability using the same high abstraction metadata that we use to create the stories. And we create user stories gathered in the field, and we mesh the databases together and we look at clusters. And what that says is that these things we're already really good at might apply to this. What do you think that means? The one I'm most ashamed of on this, which we did, is that a lighting circuit designed to handle urine-saturated staircases in Eindhoven football stadium was repurposed to create a colored rock that changes color in your swimming pool based on human proximity. And I really don't want to be associated with that, but it's made them a lot of money, right? Now, we don't do enough of that in IT. We always want a greenfield site. We want to design from scratch. The reality is we're nearly always dealing with brownfield sites. There's things we can already use. So I've gone through 3 techniques there, all of which are designed to be pre-Scrum techniques, not to compete with Scrum, but to improve the feed into Scrum. And that's where we're good. We're good at complexity. We're not good at order. That's not our specialization. Different people putting different things together at different times. And it's been quite interesting talking with Ivor Jacobson at Essence, because there's one level of granularity which he's got in the Essence approach on Scrum and on Spotify, which we can move straight across into this approach we're developing of the hexagon kits, which is basically you don't adopt a single framework or a single methods, you have collections of aspects of methods that you put together in different combinations. Right? So say that's where we're going on that side. Now, again, you see what I mean when I talk about rewilding, is we're restoring some balance into the system. Yeah. And it's a both and strategy. And remember, the whole of Cynefin is about there's nothing wrong with order. There's absolutely nothing wrong with waterfall. If you know what you've got to do, you've done it 100 times before and you know the resource, and you don't have to be agile. I still remember, with Telstra in Brisbane once, and they said, well, the only way we'll ever get promoted is being agile. So we've created 1-year sprints so we can say we're agile, but carry on doing waterfall. And I thought that's Australian pragmatism, but it makes a lot of sense, right? So there's a famous British phrase on this, and the Cheltenham Gold Cup is just on. So this reminds me of it. Horses for courses. Different methods and tools work in different contexts. The whole purpose of Cynefin is to work out first what type of system you're in, and then select methods appropriate to that system. And methods that move things between domains are more valuable than methods that stay within domains. Right? So the value of Scrum is the ability to take something borderline complex, complicated, and make it complicated. The value of the things I've talked about is to shift it from complex into that liminal domain, so things like Scrum can use it, because we've had that better creation of the funnel, at the front end. So I've tried to make this a mixture of theory and practice. This is probably more practice than theory in such sense. But there are a few sort of dangers there are three basic rules about how you manage a complex system. And I'll stop with this and leave, one more thing after that. First is you need to optimize the granularity of what you're dealing with. It doesn't matter whether it's software code, and to be quite honest, microservices is not the same as object orientation. I still don't think we treated object orientation properly, and I was on Corba committees back in the 80s. And I remember arguing then that people are objects too. Yeah, that actually you can define people as objects and software as objects, and provided you've got inheritance and input-output definition, you can allow these things to recombine in different ways. If you think about it, that's what social media is all about. It's a few stable elements that recombine. Applications are emergent properties of the interaction of people with finely grained software objects over time. And that's an architectural principle we don't do enough of. So granularity is key. The second is you need to distribute and diversify cognition. You need to find the 70% who've seen the gorilla. And the problem is IT as an industry is highly specific in terms of cognitive and cultural backgrounds. I'll also say, by the way, it's still the most misogynist part of any company, and that is an ongoing problem for the Agile community, right? Because it's really not addressing that in any significant way. But it lacks cognitive diversity. It's why IT people don't like users very much, because they're cognitively very different. Right? So you need to build cognitive cultural diversity into your cognitive system, but not your decision-making system. You distribute cognition, but not decision-making, because you want to see multiple perspectives and you want to find those outlier groups. And we don't do enough of that in user requirements or whatever. And the third is called disintermediation. And that's why we give programmers raw stories, not story points. Because in writing a story point, you're making assumptions which may not be shared. If I'm working with C-level executives, we do this, so basically a C-level executive can go direct from an abstraction to the raw story of a customer without anybody interpreting it. Right? So you want coders to work with real user experiences, because the coder will see things in those experiences that the story point creator may not see. Disintermediation is about removing those individual, removing those interpretive layers as you go through in terms of the way it works. So those are three basic principles of how you design complexity. The final one I want to make, and this is the latest paper which we just produced. Some of you may already have read this, but I'll put the link up. By the way, this is very academic, and I don't agree with all of it because it's co-authored. Co-authored papers, you never agree with everything, right? We've been taking constructor theory from quantum mechanics and applying it to human systems. Now, the way constructor theory works, I'm just going to drop a hint on this because we've now linked this mapping of this into EU field guide mapping. So there's a whole, how do you map what happened during COVID or what happened during a crisis, which we've put together based on that, and this is part of that. So what happened with Deutsch's work in Oxford is he said we need to treat physics at a system level, not an atomistic level. So physics is traditionally trying to find the smallest possible particle. Personally, I think we went far enough with quarks. I like quarks, they come in threes, right? But my background is theoretical physics and philosophy, so I have favoritism in this respect, right? And then you try and understand the universe based on those parts. What Deutsche did is say we need to understand the system as a whole. So the first thing we do is identify the counterfactuals, the things which can't happen. Gravity isn't going to change. Yeah, and that creates a landscape. And then within that landscape, we identify constructors. So those are things which are, in Deutsch's terms, unchanging things, which produce replicable results. By the way, this is attractive in quantum mechanics because constructors get rid of quantum uncertainty, and that resolves a few issues or problems. So we've taken that and said, well, actually, we can map constraints. From constraints, so constraints which will take a long time to change and a lot of energy are counterfactual constraints. Where you have low energy cost of change and rapid change, it's a risk area. And where are the constructors, the constraints which are producing consistent replicable results? Scrum, for example, is a constructor. You put something into Scrum, it will produce similar results. And then, so what we do now is we map the counterfactuals, the constructors, and the white spaces. And in the white spaces, we do safe to fail experiments to create constructors. Okay? So what we're doing is mapping and changing the landscape within which people make decisions. And I'm going to sort of leave this hanging, all right? That means scaffolding becomes key. All right, so scaffolding is a thing around which people and software interact. And you can have endoskeletons or exoskeletons. So if you've got a scaffolding structure, it creates coherence, but you can get variety within it. So this is a finely grained approach, right? The other big thing about this is whatever has the lowest energy gradient will win. And part of the problem with Agile is we keep saying we want to be Agile, and that's too high an energy gradient. So the reason SAFE worked, there are three. I mean, you've got to qualify email marketing. He got it wrong with Roop. He got it right with SAFE. First of all, he started selling it with a Ponzi scheme. If you did the 4-day course, you could do the 3-day course, provided you sold the fee. Yeah, so all of the Agile coaches were desperate for new things to sell. So that was quite clever. Yeah. Then he created something which said it was Agile, but looked like waterfall. So that made IT directors really happy. We got a lot of structure. And the third and the genius thing is it would cost you several $1 million in 3 years to implement. Senior executives love things like that because they can get all the credit for starting them and they move jobs before the mess gets delivered. Yeah. So again, what we're trying to say is that sort of thing has to be broken. And by the way, don't say that SAFE is a Trojan horse, yeah, because just remember what happened to King Priam and all of his citizens, right? Just think about that. Trojan horses have a negative output. So rewilding is about changing the granularity of what we work, of distributing a combination, of combining and recombining, but really importantly, of not trying to move people into a space which is so far away from where they are that it's too difficult to achieve. And the really massive difference between systems thinking and complexity thinking, and they are not the same thing. Well, there are several differences. One is systems thinking defines systems as having boundaries. Complexity says some systems have boundaries, some don't. Okay? But the really important difference is in complexity, we start journeys with a sense of direction. We don't try and achieve goals in a future state. So what's really important is to map where we are and where we can go next. And if you want a simple way of remembering it, this is called the Frozen 2 strategy. Anybody watch Frozen 2 yet? Okay, well, you've all got a good reason now, right? You don't have to have grandchildren or young children to do it. I've just, Complexity Guru has told you to go watch it, all right? It's a great complexity movie, right? And in the middle of it, the real heroine of the movie, who's the younger sister without the magic, and this was recently sung in a Ukrainian refugee held, sings, all I can do is do the next right thing. It's actually a beautiful bit in the movie. In complexity, that's called the adjacent possible. So you map where you are, you identify where you can go next, you go there ideally in parallel to several places, and then you look again. And that requires finely grained methods, combination, multi-vendor, not single proprietary frameworks. And for God's sake, get rid of the bloody certificates, right? I've got 3 sets of letters I can put after my name. All of them resulted from 3 or 4 years of study in an external examination board, not from turning up on a 2-day course yeah, and filling out a form at the end of it. And with that, I'll open it for questions or arguments.
Thank you, David. I think we need to take like a little pause so you can have a sip of whatever you're having and people can...
Gin.
Exactly, gin.
Good Welsh gin, this is.
So I'll launch a poll for now, so we all kind of have a little breather, because you always produce a lot and very dense, and it's all exciting. So the poll I'm launching right now is to for you to answer a couple questions. How valuable was the event for you today, and how much you're going to recommend our meetup to others? Let's do it quick, and then we move on to Q&A.
Been reading Net Promoter Score articles as well, haven't you? It's a good example of Goodhart's law. When a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a measure.
David, what was that book that you measured, or that you mentioned, the story?
Which one? The
Frozen
Field
2?
Guide?
Frozen 2, yeah.
Frozen 2, it's a movie. It's a Disney movie.
Oh, Frozen 2, okay.
Frozen 1 is pretty crap Disney, all right? But it was so successful, they had the money to do Frozen 2 properly. And Frozen 2 is a great complexity movie.
Okay.
Including the dam breaking and the forest and everything. It's a really good movie.
Oh. No spoilers. Okay.
All right. I think I'm done with poll, so we can go ahead with questions.
If you put your hand up, I think you just speak unless somebody's chairing this. Dana, yeah.
Hello, hi Dave. Thank you very much. It was an amazing lecture, and my head is just like too full of ideas. I'll spend a couple of months untangling it, but thank you so much for the content and all the context. And my question is, so listening to you, everything makes sense. What I feel like you are articulating so many things that I believe many of us in the audience, kind of felt and were not able maybe to put in words, and you are so much ahead of us, and you just say that it makes perfect sense. And what's your experience of, basically, I'll be very blunt, I'm a consultant and I was involved in sales. So when you are selling this, when you are selling your approach to the executives, or in your case to some high-ranked politicians, what are the reactions, and maybe what types of questions are you receiving, and what types of objections are you receiving from them, if you are receiving any?
No, several. So first of all, we sometimes call complexity the science of common sense. I.e. people, the minute you talk about a complexity perspective, people get it because it's now a scientific explanation of reality. And one of the most formative political moments is when I met a guy called John Poindexter, who Americans will remember was Reagan's national security advisor. And I didn't know who he was till after I decided that I liked him. And Welsh socialists aren't meant to like, former Ronald Reagan supporters, but he's a really good guy. And he saw Cynefin, he said, that explains 50 years of failure in American foreign policy. We've treated complex as if it was complicated, and that's a national security advisor, right? So I think the reality is you've got that sort of pattern, in terms of the way things work, right? So it's not that people don't recognize it. The problem is you've got to move people, and you've got to be consistent from where they are to where you want them to be. So people who advocate complexity as some sort, I ban the word transformation from any change process. They just ban it. I mean, it was wrong in the first place. It's corrupted anyway. So, for example, if we're working on organizational change, I'm doing this with 2 pharma companies at the moment. It's not all government. We don't say, guys, if so, for example, I come for 360-degree feedback, right? Let's take a good example. 360 is eminently gameable. I got into a lot of trouble with IBM HR because I got really irritated with them. So I kept gaming their system They're creating a website where you could sign up to be somebody's third quartile responder. Yeah, and when they found out about it, they got irritated, not as irritated as they got when I proved astrology was more accurate than Myers-Briggs in determining team performance. They got really irritated by that one because they paid for it, right? So we take a different approach. We say, you're a leader, you nominate people. Anybody you nominate, every time they interact with you, they describe the interaction. You never evaluate. They describe the interaction, then they interpret on this high abstraction metadata concept we developed and patented. And so one of the triangles in that says, in this observation, the leader's behavior was analytical, altruistic, assertive. See, 3 positive? So you can only be positive. But then you as a leader look at it and you're all assertive, analytical, not altruistic. So you realize you've got to change your behavior so you can literally click on the thing and say, I need more observations like these and fewer like those. That's a whole new theory of change. We're launching that, by the way, as a club for Agile people, for Agile team feedback. Now, I know that can replace all of HR's 360 feedback and save a huge amount of fortune, but you're not going to break HR of that. So you go into HR and say, well, look, you know, do your leaders have difficulty with the 360 because they're nervous about it coming up? And they say, well, yes, we are. So, well, why don't we put this in place for a couple of months before the formal 360 so they can get feedback? And then let them work out when they should replace it. Yeah. What we're doing in Agile is say there's nothing wrong with Scrum, but we need some stuff before it. This is a low risk thing, right? So you always do a both and starting where people are. You don't go in with, I've just been on this wonderful complexity course, and this is now the future of life, the universe, and everything. We need to abandon everything we've done before and all become complex, all right? Because that's the mistake Agile made. No?
Thank you very much.
I'm going to go in order on the screen. So David, and unless Volker or somebody wants to do this. Oh, there's 2 David, Schweitzer.
Yeah, I'll grab it. So thanks so much. I'll have to go watch the recording for the stuff I couldn't process in real time. And I think I'm speaking for a couple of other people, kind of echoing this question. Things like the hexa cards you're talking about, and I know Jakobsen's essence cards, always seem to me to require a considerable amount of experience, which looking at faces, a lot of people have here. So to have the ability to choose between Agile and Waterfall and say we're going to do year-long sprints requires a whole bunch of battle scars from getting that kind of decision wrong. How do you bring this stuff to people who have very limited knowledge and experience? You know, but there's an awful lot of teams out there that don't have graybeards like me.
I originally did this in IBM, all right. So the first Hexa kit we created in IBM. I mean, hexagons are important because people combine them in different ways from cards. The tessellation is different. So hexagons actually radically improve the way people interact. Yeah, it's quite surprising. We actually found in IBM that so the card would have the name of something with a description of what it did. People without any training could combine it and say, what does this mean? Now, we've also done that with the hexes. So we're not going down to Jakobsen's level. I think he goes down too far. And he's also got this belief that there is an essence to everything. And I actually think there isn't, right? I never liked Neoplatonism and I'm not prepared to adopt it now. Agile people should stop reading up on Plato's cave and go somewhere else, right? So what we've got is QR codes on all the cards, which then link you with the wiki or with the proprietary website and the method tool providers, so you can read up on it. And what we found in IBM is if you give people a sort of high abstraction description of what something does, they'll put them together and they will actually experiment because they quite like that idea of entangled trios. They'll put it in and you don't have to sell it because they've chosen it. Yeah, but the granularity is right on that. So that's what we found in IBM and we're replicating that now. And I think you've got to get to the point where users can understand what software can deliver for them or what software methods do. Yeah, you can't entirely make it an expert software-driven thing. Right, so for example, give an example of the stock exchange one I talked about. IBM went ballistic with me halfway through the workshop because I put the risk premiums of our estimating up on the screen to the client. I've never had, I got this virulent attack, but the client then said, but we could reduce that for you. And we ended up co-negotiating the risk premium, which meant we were 2 million under Accenture at lower risk. Right? But that was done without the need, the experts were behind the process. So that's what we're trying to do with the cards. Behind the cards, there's expertise, but you need to understand what the cards do at a user type level without the need for deep study. David Parker?
Okay, here we go. And this is where I risk making a fool of myself just for opening a question to my hero. So thank you very much for the presentation today. And one of the things I actually wanted to comment on was how much I appreciated you connecting the contribution of Dsdm to the Agile Manifesto. And that's sort of, I think, what's underlying the question here. It's, and generally maybe it's a commentary on, I'm seeking a commentary on tools, but I think a lot of us are coming from environments with misapplied Scrum, where we're trying to coach and support environments that have made a machine out of the IT organization where it should be much more creative. And you indicated a couple of things like techniques or practices that can be used to harness that creativity. But one of the things that occurs to me is that breaks the rules of the tools that most of our organizations use. They like the predictability and the structure and the rigidity of having a defined sprint cadence or a regulated way of managing backlogs. So what do you advise in terms of helping us to move to a more complexity-based way of organizing, given we're dealing with legacy tools and mindsets?
It's interesting because, I mean, DSM, I think, lost its direction a bit. At the business agility, people are trying to put it back together, I think, all right, having talked with them. It was meant to be a collection of open source methods that you combined and recombined. So, we were doing that, but then it became a certification house like everything else. And I think that was a mistake, right? But the principle is still there. So I think the secret is to provide the certainty in the components, but not the overall thing. So, yeah, but fundamentally a complex system is coherent objects with defined interactions. So you say, we'll use Scrum, but we might have a 3-month box instead of a 2-week box. That's not scary. Yeah. Scrum works really well here, but we need to feed it better. So these are methods we can use to feed it. Yeah. So you're basically taking this both and approach and recognizing where people are and talking about shifting. Yeah. We're about to launch a program, hopefully this year, with UCL and others on a complexity approach to project management. And that's the same principle, that there are aspects of project which have such a high level of uncertainty. You should be doing multiple micro projects to see what happens before you define the over delivery. And if you're doing waterfall, actually minor deviations should scare the living daylights out of you. Whereas if you're doing agile, minor deviations are part of the system. So again, it's that finding ways to explain things in terms of where people are and making incremental changes on the present. The other thing I always say to people is focus on intractable problems, not on low-hanging fruit. If you want to introduce something new, find the thing that people know the old techniques don't work for and offer something which is risk-free, which might solve the problem. That's more successful. The other thing, and this is Fletcher's, there are 3 big frameworks in the Cynefin firmament. One is Cynefin, one is Fletcher's curves, and the other is the S-drawing framework. And by the way, I've condensed a 3-day masterclass into this lecture, and we're planning to bring that to the States in October. Yeah. Fletcher's curve says 13.5, yes, it's based on market life cycle theory. New things will only be bought by a small percentage of the market anyway. And the tactic for selling to that end of the market is very difficult from tackling the mature end. Yeah. And so you have to understand where an organization is in its own life cycle in terms of what degree of novelty it will accept. And I used to do a lot of sales training around that, selling people to understand the context of the company and the decision maker before you decide what to sell to them. Stephen Dukas, is it Daukas or Dukas? Daukas.
Daukas, but good enough, right? So I'm having trouble structuring my question because it's recursive in a way. So I'm going to start with my bias, the work I've done. Interestingly enough, I'm one of those agile coaches that a very large company hired because I said, you really don't want to buy into the certifications and, you know, all that sort of stuff. But my bias is that leadership want a way to homogenize everything so they can feel good about that they somehow have made an infallible decision, right? So I think that's my bias starting, right? And so how have you helped people that think this way? You know, the short term, quarterly return, tell the analysts in the market how you're doing and so forth. And how do you get them to think bigger than that so they don't fall in love?
That's their reality.
Well, okay.
Agile people need to understand the reality of leadership and C-level. Even when you think something should change, you can't change because of the external pressures. So you have to find a way to address the thing which is causing that behavior rather than tell them the behavior is wrong.
No, I agree with that. That's why I say it's a bias. It's more about stop them from falling in love with package solutions with certifications and a framework.
That's what you do. So, you know, if they're obsessed with certifications, then fine, just let it run for a bit, all right? I've discovered actually we'll give people a certificate of attendance, but we won't give them a certificate of competence, and everybody's happy because they've got some. If we make it look fancy, they love it and they put it on the wall, right? So I can reconcile with that, all right? You just want a bit of paper, do you, right? I think this is really important. The amount of Agile conferences where people say that the leadership don't understand Agile. If the leadership don't understand Agile, it's your problem, not theirs.
That's right.
All right, C-level, you don't get to be C-level if you're stupid.
That's right.
All right, and I remember when I was C-level, all right, you get like 3 minutes to make a decision. And you do that 20 or 30 times a day. And you got all these people telling you how you should make it. So you go with the people you already trust or you go with the nobody gets fired for implementing the McKinsey's report. I commissioned McKinsey's twice and completely ignored what they said. But the fact I commissioned them got the venture capitalists off my back where I sorted it out. So you need to understand very few people in Agile have got C-level experience or, to be honest, management experience outside a narrow technical competence.
Absolutely.
And you need to partner with people who've got that and deal with reality, all right? Bertold? I'm still going left to right on the top of my screen here.
That's quite all right. Hi. So I actually had an answer to David Parker earlier with regards to legacy mindset and tools. I think we put a lot of emphasis on that problem that we are facing, like you just said, you know, the C-level mindset and that sort of thing. That has always bothered me to sort of shelve these kinds of or categorize these kinds of ideas, because in the end, if you introduce a level of abstraction, everybody contributes, everybody works together. And so if you can try and get a safe space for everybody who's involved to sort of collaborate, come together, that is as risk-free as you can allow it. I agree that it doesn't have to be, you know, it can't be something that is not worthwhile to the organization, but at the same time, if the risk is too high, the rejection rate is very high, and try and find a way to sort of compartmentalize that and think of it as a sort of startup within the company. That's something I'm trying to instill in companies. And to your talk, David, I earlier made the comment that you'd lost me about half an hour later than after you started the talk. So it's quite challenging following you at this late hour. But you spoke about parallel experiments in complex environments, and that Scrum is inherently not the best choice for that. And I was wondering, if we run parallel experiments, doesn't that mess with our control ability for the environment? And also secondly, if we did want to do this, what would stop us from doing it within the sprint? If there's an overarching hypothesis for the sprint that we want to prove, what stops us from running one experiment one day, the other the next day, or as you pointed out, an 8-hour shift at one location, then hand over to a next 8-hour shift in another location, and then once around the world until you wake up in the morning?
Okay, so first of all, on your earlier comment, I sort of agree, but I want to qualify it.
Please
so
do.
One of the things I did a lot of work on peace and reconciliation back in the 70s in Ireland, right? And there were two approaches. One was the Corrymeela approach, by which you got everybody together and talked to them about how they should be nice to each other and got them into a collaborative environment, and be a good idea if we didn't throw petrol bombs at each other, right? Which is what a lot of agile people think you do. If you just get everybody in a room with a good facilitator, magically it will solve itself. Now, if you want to see that satirized, I'll put the link into episode 1 of series 2 of Derry Girls, where the Catholic girls are forced into a peace and reconciliation process with the Protestant boys, which is hysterically funny, right? We took small numbers of people from both communities and dumped them into Latin America for 6 months, and we didn't talk about Catholic-Protestant divide. And as they worked together and they discovered they had a lot more in common than they thought, and they started to have conversations, but in their own time at their own pace. We're currently doing that in the US on Red v. Blue. Yeah, get people from Republican and Democrat backgrounds at a highly localized level working together and let them have the conversation about the political differences when they're ready for it. Yeah. And that's what the Entangled Trios method does. It brings people together from different backgrounds in multiple small groups to work on something they find meaningful and to talk about their differences without facilitation. Yeah. Part of the problem with an industry based on coaching is people are obsessed with the expertise of the coach, and with the facilitation techniques. And I always say you should never use any technique which comes sideways from therapy, because it assumes people need therapy and it privileges the therapist. All right, and that there are significant problems with that. On the safe to fail experiments, there are different techniques. So mutation over 24 hours is a linear technique. Running a sprint over different projects in sequence means that actually the first one will generally always win. Yeah, the essence of a complex approach is you identify all the coherent hypotheses, and we generally talk now about probes, not experiments. So for every coherent hypothesis, you construct a short cycle safe to fail probe, and you run them in parallel and you see what happens, because they'll change the space. So entangled trios will have 15 trios working on a problem. That changes the nature of the problem by definition. So and it's got to be a micro level. Scrum is too chunked, it's too big, it's too expensive. Yeah, it's not small enough to allow for successive failure. Robin.
Okay.
And then Barton.
I have to unmute myself. Thanks. Many people meant a very dense talk, so I'm one of those ones that will have to take it away and rewatch it and process some of the stuff that you've spoken about. But I'm interested. I work in, and I'm sure other people are in the same space, either in an organisation like this or work with consultants with organisations like this. But I'm in an organisation. I work in a utility industry, electricity. We're hugely disrupted. There's a lot of change happening. As an organisational response, we've said we're going to implement, Agile, which is basically reduced to Scrum. And we say that, but it really happens in pockets. And we've really become an organisation that's sort of pulling against each other in trying to find equilibrium in response to disruption. We've now created an undercurrent of chaos, which we pretend is okay because we're being adaptive, but it's really chaos because we're pulling against ourselves. When you talk about some of the theories and some of the concepts you're talking about, one of the things that comes up with us all the time is Scrum is expensive and those types of things. But now we're talking about something different. And if I think about, there's a whole range of us that are sort of saying, that the approach doesn't work. We need to think differently about this. But cognitively, people are becoming fatigued. You know, we're pulling them this way, then we're pulling them this way. We're saying, no, that's not right. Now go down this, do this framework. No, go down this framework. Go, no, be adaptive and use your own, trust yourselves. At what point do we break the person with the fatigue of different concepts and ideas? And at what point from that does emerge something different, something new that the C-suite can sign into, and an organization can emerge in some ways from that chaos to being functional?
So I'm working with one organization in the UK at the moment, which has got exactly that problem. So they decided to go agile to solve problems that they hadn't properly defined. And they're about to run a sort of conversion experience, a Billy Graham event, where everybody will be brought into an open space to go through role playing, God knows what else, to make sure that they're aligned. Now, these things never work, yeah? And the people we're talking with know they're not going to work, but they've got to go through them anyway, right? I say the secret is evolution, not revolution. And one of Agile's big problems is it tried to say that if we became Agile, it would solve the problems of life, the universe, and everything. And any intelligent person knows the answer to that is 42 anyway. So why are you starting down the same track, right? So I think the secret on that is to say, look, Scrum, you know, we can't expect everybody to do Scrum. Yeah, we need some pre-Scrum techniques, because if you know, Scrum is very expensive if you allow it to fail too frequently. Yeah, so how you feed it is critical. So we can improve how we feed Scrum. And there are also some projects which, to be quite honest, should be pseudo waterfall. So we should use time boxes rather than Scrums. So keep the same Scrum technique, but make the 2 weeks, 3 months, or 2 months, or 6 months, and define it. Now, what I'm doing there is minor changes to the existing, right? The other thing is people need stability. So architects can handle a lack of stability, coders generally can't. Okay? So you shouldn't expect people to work outside their level of confidence until they get experience. And there is this sort of pseudo democratization about Agile, in which everybody is meant to be making all the decisions all of the time, and teams are meant to be, and it's just nonsense, all right? There's a thing called the Ashen framework we use for this, which stands for artifacts, skills, heuristics, experience, and natural talent. And one of the things we do is we map the knowledge required for methods across that. And the more it's orientated towards experience and natural talent, the more you're going to have fewer people able to execute, and it's going to take them longer to train. And those are the people you need to retain. I think the next big thing, to be honest, in Agile, after we got the multi-methods thing, is to completely relook at systems architecture. And we're already starting to do that. Yeah, because architecture is the big missing component on Agile. And also all of the Agile methods assume a manufacturing metaphor, not a service metaphor. And that's the problem with deriving everything from Lean. Lean is about manufacturing, it's not about service. Right? And you've got to start to think about co-evolutionary ecosystems rather than manufacturing processes. And that's the sort of key metaphor shift, if you want it. Barton?
Hi.
You're the last hand up. So you're the only thing between me, my curry, and another gin and tonic. So.
Well, I'll be as quick as I possibly can. I wouldn't want to get in the way.
No, it's okay. Don't worry.
I'm interested in kind of the evolution of your own thinking, because when you were talking about the most recent paper that you've done, I was thinking back to when I was introduced to your work, and at the time when you were doing SenseMaker, you were talking a lot about landscapes and mapping them, and the idea of simulation. And my sense is that you haven't talked a lot about simulation in this talk or recently, but you are still talking about mapping. So I just wanted to kind of get a feel for.
Yeah, I remember I'm a generalist, all right? So I mean, you need to understand my family background, all right? My mother was born above a whorehouse in Cardiff and fought her way out through education and studied German in Hanover in 1947. So she had to wear a passport around her neck so she wouldn't get raped by British and American soldiers, all right? So education in my household was it, right? we'd read the whole of the Bible and Shakespeare by the time we were 11, because we wouldn't, it was that sort of fierce environment, right? And we were generalists. So the assumption is, I mean, I always read in history or management science or physical science or science fiction or something. I've got all of those on the run, yeah? And there aren't many generalists left under the age of 50 in the UK or the US, because the education system doesn't throw them out anymore.
Right.
Yeah? And the way generalists works is they're constantly synthesizing an evolutionary pathway. So landscapes, first time I thought of that, I was working on a battlefield simulation in Singapore, and they had a 3D landscape of Singapore. And that triggered with a conversation I had with Stu Kaufman about fitness landscapes, so that we brought into SenseMaker. Yeah. I've now got on the floor around me loads of books about sea charts, because the estuarine metaphor is really powerful, because I'm trying to get away from constructional law and flow. Not that flow isn't important, but we're talking about an estuary as a model, because the tide goes in and the tide goes out. And you can do things at high tide and low tide you can't do at other times. And you've got granite cliffs and sandbanks, so you've got a fluid, complex environment. And one of the things I'm now working on, now we've got the constraint to counterfactuals to the constructors, is to create literally symbolic dashboards, which actually map the strategic space in which people are operating. And that is where I'm moving on architecture as well. You need an ecosystem architecture, not a mechanical architecture.
So would you liken that to digital twin sort of approach? Or
no, not really. I think we're moving away from that. It's like the issue about, you know, flights as well. I think the fractality is different from flights, right? So you see, one of the things I've always worked on maps is fractal representation of map. So you should have a map at your level of competence to act on it. Yeah, so maps will be different for different
layers for different people, for different actions.
Well, it's fractal, so it's self-similar. So for example, if I'm doing a change initiative, we might capture stories from the whole of the workforce. We'll then show the board the narrative landscape for the whole company and say, what can you as a board do to create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? You're not allowed to say what anybody else should do. It's only what you can do. But then a business unit gets a map from the same source data. Yeah, but of course they're in a different pace, so they'll go in a different direction, but overall the system will align. And that's fractal. It's not layered, it's fractal. But in terms of where I am at the moment, all right, so Cynefin is more or less final now. The big, and it's taken 20 years, which they do. I mean, people who produce frameworks based on studying 6 companies just don't know what they're talking about, right? The last unresolved tension in Cynefin was the central domain, and once we got a priori, and that resolved that. Fletcher's curves is more or less final. The next big one is estuarine, and I'm working on that. Yeah. So Cynefin is how do you make decisions? Fletcher's curves is when can you make decisions? And estuarine is where the hell are you anyway and what's possible. Right, so those 3 start to come together. Yeah,
that's great. Thank you.
Pleasure. Awesome. No more hands, Elena. Okay.
I think that is our opportunity to conclude.
Actually, I've got one question, if you don't mind. Sorry.
Oh, sorry, David. I missed you.
No problem, David. Question. Yeah. I really like the concept of the entangled trios. Originally, I was going to ask you about building organizations from the get-go using that. Then you mentioned grandparent system, transgeneration, and I was thinking back to that ugly word of Brexit a few years ago, when the transgenerations were all at each other's neck. I was wondering, sort of moving.
And now we know who funded it as well, so it's quite amusing.
My question is actually moving to that concept is education. Do you think it's applicable for education, bringing multiple people together, and how would you do that?
And I actually think, I mean, I'm quite proud of entangled trios. I think it's been about 6 years in gestation. I think it's a governance mechanism. So if you look at things like, I mean, holacracy is failing left, right, and center, right, as is sociocracy, because their algorithmic approach is based on rules. What entangled trios does is it says if these 3 people agree on something, they can make the decision. Okay? So it allows, and what we talk about is you need to distribute decision-making, not delegate decision-making. And the mistake sociocracy and holacracy make is they assume you delegate it within a rule structure. Actually, you need to distribute it.
So how would that apply in education, say multi-generation education?
Well, first of all, multi-generation is important. Grandparents were the primary teachers. I mean, if you look at it in evolutionary terms, the brain starts to lose plasticity around puberty. Mm-hmm. Yeah, you don't see racism before puberty, it clicks in after that. Because in evolutionary terms, you've now got to adopt the prejudices of your tribe in order for the tribe to function. Yeah. If you survive into your late 40s, then you've obviously got something about you, but you can't lead the tribe anymore. So you have to retire into the wisdom business. Yeah, which means you teach the children. Yeah, most, and we're going back to it with 2 or 3 jobs. Most people responsible for active teaching were the grandparent generation, not the child generation. So I think we can do a lot in education to increase that peer type support. Yeah. And I think, I remember when I was in school, and it's bad when you remember this, there were 2 or 3 things which are really important. One is prefects were quite important. So basically senior pupils together with the staff manage discipline. Now, okay, we were allowed to cane people, which I probably wouldn't recommend.
I think I was the last person to be caned.
Well, when I met my bank manager, it turned out he was an obstreperous 5th form that I'd caned when he was at school, but he hasn't held it against me, right? But some of the stuff we're doing, for example, with 16-year-olds is to get 16-year-olds to be citizen ethnographers into their communities, and then to combine them with the community, working with their grandparents to come up with solutions together with teachers. So we're creating a distributed meshing. We're breaking the boundaries down between the school and the community. And if you want to, we've got a big paper on citizen engagement on the website, which describes some of that with school packs. Yeah. I think also one of the other things that this is all about is changing the measurement system, because schools are currently under a highly perverted measurement system, which creates all the wrong behavior. So one of the big things we can do with the landscapes, coming back to Barton's question, is we can measure what's called a vector measure. And a vector measures direction and speed of travel for intensity of effort. It doesn't measure goal achievement. Right? So in a complex world, you need to measure vectors. In an ordered world, you can measure outcome. And the trouble is, in education, we measure everything by outcome, so we get perverted results.
So just a quick follow-up to that. You said plasticity is lost around puberty. If we're engaging grandparents and 16-year-olds, haven't we already lost? Isn't that too late?
I know, the point is it comes back. It's interesting, late 40s, 50s, it comes back again. Okay. There are chemicals which actually start to break the brain patterns up a bit. And the argument is that actually, and I enjoy this, all right? I'm coming up to 68 now, all right? I can now get away with saying things. When I said them in my 50s, I was called an arrogant bastard. Now in my 60s, it's considered wisdom of ages. So you can get away with murder, right, if you do this, all right?
Is that like Chinese whisperers?
Well, yeah, and variations on that. So I think, it's interesting as well. You get, a lot of your neocortex processing is done by your carers until you hit 2 or 3. So there are patterns of change over time, right? And so what we're doing with transgenerational is put in 2 different types of plasticity together. Mm-hmm. So if you look in the humanities, innovation tends to be synthesis. In the sciences, it's originality. And you have to be young to do innovation in sciences. In the humanities, it tends to be older because it's more synthesis. Right. So you're combining those 2 different types of knowledge.
Okay. I'm sorry, you mentioned something else. So you've been talking about diversity, which is wonderful. But again, when you're 40, 50, the old dogs, new tricks, going to the diversity, let's just say racism or those kind of problems, is that going to change when you're 40?
It's a trained behavior, all right? And I'm a male of a generation, which means if I see somebody gay, I sort of have a physical reaction, which I know I shouldn't have, right? But I can contain that, and I've got good gay friends, and I spend time with them. The 2 from San Francisco didn't understand Wagner, I've never spoken to again. Sorry, I didn't know that there's a part of the San Francisco Opera which is gay pickup area, and I was there, right? So after we'd negotiated something, this guy with his husband had never seen Wagner, so I got them tickets in London. And at the end of Act 1 of Parsifal, I said, "What did you think of that?" And they said, "It was okay," and I've never spoken to them again. So it's not a legitimate response to Act 1 of Parsifal, right? So I think we have the ability to overcome prejudices and create structure as well. Sorry. I think but what doesn't happen is if you try and suppress things, you've got to be open about that sort of thing. And you've got to allow people to develop that, right? Now, and also, I mean, we're doing several diversity programs at the moment. Diversity is not about token quotas, it's about attitude change. Right? As I say, the big thing Agile needs to address is misogyny, not diversity. In fact, I'd argue the States is more misogynist than it is racist in many ways, right? And if you look at the comparative tests of coders, if they don't disclose gender, if you look at what my sister went through, she was a systems programmer. She'd come in every morning to obscenity all over a screen. All right, and that was only 10 years ago before she retired. And that sort of thing is really common. Now, there's a point at which you address that by firing people. Yeah. And I got into trouble when I was a general manager because I filed 2 very successful salesmen, for rampant sexism and sexual abuse of consultants. And I still remember the board saying, why did you do this? They generated this amount of revenue. I said, it's totally unacceptable. The consultants do most of the work anyway. You can't have that. So there is a point at which you actually have to take drastic action. And HR departments are very, very reluctant to do that on diversity issues. And we had a proven case of racism in IBM, and IBM did not want it to go to court. So they just paid a fortune to settle it outside court so that they could brush it under the carpet and pretend it hadn't happened. And that just meant you encourage more people to do the same thing downstream. Yeah, so I think, but we've got to find ways to measure diversity which are not quota-based. And we've got a couple of projects on that at the moment.
Yeah, that's great. Could you send me that link you mentioned about education, if you have that?
Yeah, it's on our website. If you go onto the Cynefin company website, you'll find stuff there.
Beautiful, thanks, David.
Valentina, you've had your hand up for ages while David asked 4 supplementary questions.
And let's make that the last question so that we can wrap up for today.
I will be very quick. Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the talk. So I think I'm younger here than most people. I'm just finishing my master's, and I just have a super quick question. As a person who is deeply interested and wants to devote her life to this, where do you advise me to start my career to get kind of most exposed to what you teach?
Okay, move around a lot. I went from HR to finance to technical consultancy to strategy. Also study different areas. I mean, I wrote a paper for the ITIL community which said no software engineer should be allowed out without a basic training in ethics, and I still stand by that. Most, it's a big problem we got with AI. Most people in AI are misogynist white males who take Ayn Rand seriously after puberty, which to me is grounds for confinement to a mental hospital, right? So read anthropology, read cognitive science, just read in many subjects. And early on in your career, move around between roles. If you spent time in HR, if you spent time in finance, if you spent time in operations, you've got a body of experience which counts. Yeah, and and this is not you want generalists are not T-shaped. T-shaped, that's a mistake. If you're a deep specialist with broad knowledge, that's not the same thing as a generalist. A generalist is actually shallow dive across everything. You can't be deep in one area. Yeah. So read broadly, read science fiction, read history. Yeah, go to the MIT bookshop in Cambridge, which is the world's best bookshop, and just find books with interesting titles, right? And just get around.
Great, awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay, you're all yours, Volker.
That is a great place to stop for today. Read.